Good evening, everyone. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. Thank you for tuning into another live stream. As you can see, our friend Brian Berletic, friend of the show, host of the New Atlas, is back with me this evening. Brian, thank you so much for joining me again tonight.
Thank you so much for having me back. Bring my microphone over here.
Of course. Well, let's get right started. Everybody, hit the like button before we get started. That helps boost the stream in YouTube's algorithm. You can subscribe if you're new here, and of course, the video description is all the places where you can support this channel. But first, okay, Brian, let us talk about what is going on. We have to begin with what Europe just did, essentially holding an emergency summit for Ukraine, which much of what was said equates to a declaration of World War III against Russia. I want to play for you a few clips from what Emmanuel Macron said. Okay, so here we go. We can play first. Afshin Rastanzi posted this. I want you to listen really closely to Emmanuel Macron's words. Here we go.
Peace will return to our continent with a pacified Russia.
Peace will return to our continent with a pacified Russia. Now, I want to now get into another clip here where he talks about nuclear weapons after that talk about Russia.
We need reforms, we need to make choices, and we need to be brave. Our nuclear deterrent helps us. It is comprehensive. It is a sovereign deterrent, French from beginning to end. And since 1964, it's always played a role in preserving peace and security in Europe. The future German Chancellor has called for a strategic debate on providing that same protection from deterrent to our European allies.
So Emmanuel Macron is saying that Europe is going to provide a nuclear deterrent, in particular France. Now, I want to play what Ursula von der Leyen said in regards to what the summit actually came up with and get your reaction to all of this, Brian. Here we go.
So to conclude, Europe is ready to assume its responsibilities. Rearm Europe could mobilize close to 800 billion euros of defense expenditures for a safe and resilient Europe. We will, of course, continue working closely with our partners in NATO. This is a moment for Europe, and we are ready to step up.
So 800 plus billion, Brian. Emmanuel Macron says that France and the EU will step up to pacify Russia. Talk about this in the broader scheme of what's going on. We have Ukraine aid pause. We have a lot going on the Trump side, on the U.S. side, which has essentially, quote unquote, pushed Europe into this. What's your take?
I just want people, I know I sound like a broken record, but please recall U.S. Secretary of Defense, President Trump's Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, on February 12th. I'm looking at the Department of Defense's official website. He announced we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific, respectively. He was talking about Europe, and he literally said doubling down. I don't know if these numbers coming out of the EU right now are literally double what they were spending before. But he told them to double down, expand arms production, and take over, to double down on Ukraine specifically. There was about a week or two where there was this theater where Europe was calling America names, America was calling Europe all kinds of names. But at the end of the day, Europe is this, what they're announcing right now is literally the directive given to them by the United States, by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth on February 12th in Brussels. They're just doing exactly what the US told them to do. And if you go back to Secretary Hegseth's speech, his laying out of this directive, I mean, if you listen to it, does that sound like an administration that is interested in actual peace with Russia? over Ukraine? No, it isn't. So what is actually happening is the Trump administration is pandering to its support base. It's also, to a certain degree, pandering to the global public to make it appear as if it's interested in peace, all while taking a course of action that we have been talking about for the last 3 years that would eventually need to be taken, because they were going to lose the proxy war. And this is the way they're going to salvage it, perpetuate it, and pivot from this point onward. So it is very predictable. It's exactly as we have been warning while President Biden was still in office. This is what we were warning was going to happen. It did not matter who won the election, the US presidential election, because this agenda was going to continue, hence continuity of agenda.
Brian, comment on Europe here and France in particular. Macron, Starmer. I mean, Starmer outside of the EU, of course, but still Europe proper, the collective West. Talk about their role in all of this, because essentially what is being said is that Europe is going to continue the war on Russia, but in many respects, Europe's foreign policy has been U.S. foreign policy. Do you see this as an actual break with the United States, because Trump is promoting a foreign policy now that is saying that, no, Kellogg was just saying today, there's going to be a U.S. reset with Russia. We've heard those words before. So what is your take on Europe, especially Macron here, kind of thumping his chest like a little Napoleon toward a world war scenario with Russia, despite all of Trump's at least apparent moves to reset?
Well, it's very important to understand that Europe, in recent history, has not had independent foreign policy. It has always been an extension of American foreign policy, and it still is. And the special interests that are driving European foreign policy are the exact same interests that funded President Trump's presidential campaign, but also Kamala Harris's presidential campaign. So this is why things are continuing. If you really think about it, how does this benefit Europe in any shape, form, or way? What they are doing is stepping into the breach after Ukraine has been fully fed into this wood chipper that is American proxy war with Russia. The U.S. is simply finding a new proxy to start feeding in feet first next, and that proxy is Europe. That's what they're talking about doing. And there's a combination of preparing for confrontation with Russia, but also this nuclear saber rattling, hopefully serving as some sort of bluff that maybe the Russians will fall for, in combination with this false attempt to make some sort of peace by the U.S. with Russia reset. I've been trying to remind people that this happened under the Obama administration. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at that time met with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. They met together. They were smiling ear to ear. They even had a physical reset button that they both pressed together. Even as these theatrics were taking place, the U.S. was quietly preparing to overthrow the Ukrainian government, precipitate this proxy war in the first place. So this is just, again, it is just such an obvious, transparent continuation of this same agenda, because if you look at the special interests driving this agenda, they haven't changed. So why would their agenda change? The only thing that's changing is their approach, the narratives, and the faces that are telling these lies to the American people, the European people, but also to a wider extent, the global public.
Yeah, you've talked a lot, Brian, in your videos and your analysis on the capacity of the entire collective West to continue on this madness. I mean, Ursula von der Leyen is saying 800 plus billion. You're hearing Macron say nuclear umbrella for Ukraine. Giorgia Meloni of Italy is saying Article 5 for Ukraine without NATO membership. But the New York Times has sounded the alarm in several articles in the past few days, saying this is going to be difficult in terms of just the ability for Europe to supplant the United States, and for this conflict to continue even for another 4 months if the U.S. doesn't stop its pause. What could you talk about these limitations that are under the viral talk are not being spoken about here?
Well, I mean, we've talked for a long time about the West military-industrial base and the fact that they're being outpaced by Russia, by China, and this is a huge problem for the U.S. These special interests simultaneously want global hegemony, but they do not have the ability to create a military-industrial base or an industrial base of any kind capable of actually sustaining it. We have to understand that European and then American collective Western hegemony over the planet was a result of immense disparity between the collective West and the rest of the world in terms of industrial output, technology, military power. That disparity has narrowed, it is closing, and eventually it's going to widen in favor of the rest of the world. Nations like Russia, China, the rest of Asia, nations across Eurasia, in the Middle East, Africa, it's going to widen in their favor at the detriment, to the detriment of the US and Europe. And they're not going to make the systematic changes necessary to fix this. They can't. It goes against everything that they stand for and everything that they do as part of maintaining their power base. It's corrupt, deeply entrenched monopolies that are not interested in innovation, in reform, in competition. So they're not actually equipped to do this, but they're going to continue trying anyway. And what we're watching is just history repeating itself. Every empire has come, it has dominated, and then because it is out of touch with the reality of how the world is changing around them, and they're in denial about their own declining power, they fail to make the changes necessary to adapt, and they go into terminal decline. And that's what we're watching. But that doesn't mean that they're not still extremely dangerous, and it doesn't mean it's going to happen overnight. And I think we can see with our own eyes that it's extremely dangerous. And if you happen to be in one of these countries that gets caught in the middle of all of this, it could be catastrophic. And I think that's what's happening. That is what's going to continue happening. And I think actually the worst is still to come.
Well, with Macron's comments about pacification of Russia and the use of nuclear weapons to deter Russia, and Meloni saying that, hey, well, perhaps we can extend Article 5 to Ukraine without the U.S. and without NATO membership. All of that, Russia has said straight up that it's always an existential threat. Any kind of NATO protection for Ukraine is an existential threat. But also, they commented, both Vladimir Putin, Sergei Lavrov, and Dmitry Peskov. They all said this is Macron looking like Napoleon, and all of Europe attempting to do something that is going to lead to a historical, the exact historical situation that you just outlined, Brian.
Exactly. And again, how did any of this benefit Europe? If we look at what was going on in Europe before 2014, when the US government overthrew the elected government of Ukraine, whatever you think about that government, it was overthrown by the US. It was not a spontaneous uprising. It was planned for years and years. It was the second of two major attempts documented in the Western media itself. Europe was working with Russia. They were getting cheap energy from Russia. Their industry depended on Russia. They were also making inroads with cooperation with China. And this was actually benefiting Europe. And you could see things going in the right direction. It was very hopeful. If people can recall that period of time, how hopeful things were, that Europe would finally kind of move out from under the shadow of US primacy, start carving out an independence, responsible, constructive foreign policy with the rest of the world. And then the US overthrew Ukraine. And then they started reconsolidating control, political control over Europe, which is politically captured by US special interests. And then they started steering them into this self-destructive proxy war with Russia. And that is where they still are. And this does not benefit Europe at all in any way. So people have to stop and ask, why are they doing it? If it doesn't benefit them, it's unlikely they'll be able to do this. Just like it was unlikely Ukraine would be able to fight in this proxy war and win. Is not any more plausible for Europe to do it and win. But the US is going to feed them in anyway, because that is the whole point of having proxies. Your proxies assume all of the risk. And if there are any benefits, you are the one that gains from them. And that is what we are watching. And I see people in the comment section, I've heard this argument many times. First of all, some people didn't believe that Secretary Hegseth even said that. So when I show them the Department of Defense's website where there's a video of him saying all of these things, then they have to, in their brain, they either have to rationalize why he's saying this. So on one hand, the Trump administration is this straight shooting revolution taking place. On the other hand, it's performing mealy-mouth political tricks because it can't say what it means. It doesn't mean what it says. You can't have it both ways. So what do you think is more likely? That President Trump, who during his first 4 years continued all of this uninterrupted, what do you think is more likely? That he's doing it again and still lying like he did the last 4 years he was in office? Or this is the first time in American history a politician is actually looking out for the American people's best interest? They're genuinely going to choose peace over primacy. I mean, it's so far-fetched. There's no evidence to support it. And again, Secretary Hegseth laid the whole plan out, and now Europe is complying word for word, almost verbatim. The European leaders are repeating back what Secretary Hegseth told them a couple of weeks ago, and it's taking shape, and they're doing it. It's not a divide. Danny, you talked about the Trump administration cutting aid to Ukraine. Do we remember during the first Trump administration when he cut aid to the Syrian rebels, terrorists, whatever you want to call them? Obviously, they were still getting arms. They were still getting support. It was just being laundered through different intermediaries, to the extent that eventually last December, they were able to overthrow the Syrian government. So why do people think that this is different, that they're really, really cutting aid? All of the intelligence that they're sharing with Ukraine, they also share with the rest of Europe. And all they have to do is just have Europe share that intelligence with Ukraine. So they get the benefit of pretending to look like they're pursuing peace, all while still continuing to undermine peace, deliberately so.
And there's a certainly just an incredible amount of maneuvering, very fast paced. And I think the pause of Ukraine aid that you just mentioned, the Trump administration was very clear that this is simply a pause, and that it's already under consideration that this aid might return at any point. And because the New York Times and the neocons, they are all sounding the alarm that if this continues, if the Trump administration goes the entire extent of the negotiations with Russia without a ceasefire, without aid, there's going to be a complete collapse of the Ukrainian military. But I want to actually now show you, Brian, if you could comment on this. Okay, so this is what the New York Times had to say about what Europe is doing, because I think it supports. I'm just going to show the title first. How soon could Ukraine's forces start to buckle without U.S. weapons? And I'm going to just scroll down to this comment. And I want to read this because it gets to your point about why would Europe do this? It's obvious that while France and the UK, and there's this conflict, right, between the EU and the UK and Trump administration on the surface. That's what it looks like. But as you said, Hegseth said, this is what you're going to do now, Europe. And you're just going to do it. And then this is what the New York Times said in terms of advanced weapons like air defenses that Ukraine says are crucial to survival. They're struggling to produce those systems in large numbers. It can take years to hire and train additional workers, expand factory space, and obtain rare earths and other raw materials in a competitive market slowed down by a limited supply chain. Industry executives, military contractors, say they can't invest in those improvements without guarantees of contracts generally running for at least a decade. And some governments in Europe have been unwilling to provide this. We are not on a real war economy footing as we speak, certainly not compared to Russia, that it would take more political will in Europe to get defense contracts rolling. This is from Camille Grand, who's this neocon and former NATO secretary. now weapons expert at European Council on Foreign Relations, said money is not sufficient to solve everything. Brian, talk about how does this demonstrate this point? And could you talk about some of these weapons? Like, what exactly cannot be produced right now, which makes this whole promise seem almost unbelievably absurd on the face of it, beyond the rhetoric, which is very dangerous vis-a-vis Russia?
Yeah, well, first of all, Ukraine was already in the process of collapsing, even under the Biden administration. And weapons were grinding to a standstill even under the Biden administration. It wasn't because the Biden administration didn't want to send more weapons to Ukraine. They literally don't have them. They don't have the weapons to send to Ukraine. They have exhausted everything. They had said they were going to expand production for 3 years. They didn't manage to do it sufficiently, not even close. They didn't even come close. And Europe didn't even come close. And this goes back to the same problem, the same interests and their desire to maintain hegemony, this blind greed and desire to constantly expand profit and power is also incapable of making the sacrifices necessary to create a military industrial base like Russia and China have, which are state-owned and put purpose over profit. The collective West, the special interest that controls the collective West, is incapable of doing this. They will not do this. And so this is the paradox. They want complete power over the planet, but they're incapable of creating the tools necessary to do it. While on the other hand, Russia and China are willing to make the sacrifices necessary to prioritize purpose over profit, to create a military industrial base capable of checking otherwise unchecked Western expansion, power, and the pursuit of profit. So that is where they are right now. Danny, you were saying something about how dangerous the rhetoric is versus the reality of what they're able to do. Does anyone not hear that what Europe is saying right now is exactly what Ukraine had been saying leading up to the special military operation in 2022 and all these whole 3 years since? All of this talk about, we can do it, we're going to do this, that, and the other thing, and we're going to get the advantage over Russia. But this was just to get everyone to continue going along with it. And you look at people who are supporting Ukraine, they still buy this narrative that somehow Ukraine is going to prevail over Russia. And now they're buying into the propaganda that somehow Europe is going to be able to step in as the next proxy to take on Russia. And they imagine that somehow this is going to make a difference. But what is this really about? I mean, what was the whole point of this divide, this theater where the US is pretending that it has this huge disagreement with Europe and they're splitting off? The whole purpose was to give Europe the narrative necessary to sell to the European people, spending more on military and less on social programs. They've already been in the process of gutting these programs. Energy prices are high. Cost of living is increasing, but also in the US, by the way, don't forget about that. And how are you going to tell the European people that you need to spend this much more on military and less on social programs unless you get them hysterical? And Trump is the perfect person to make people hysterical. And you can see how it's working. And you can see how people are supporting this, at least people maybe on the fence and people who are already supporting Ukraine. This is the perfect narrative to keep it all going. And so this is exactly why they're doing it. The whole fact that Trump was able to supposedly cut all arms, all intelligence sharing. I wonder if they cut Starlink too. I haven't heard anything about that yet. I'll look and see if they've cut Starlink yet or not. But the whole fact that he was able to do this just because he had some tiff with Zelensky in the Oval Office tells you that he actually could have ended this conflict any time of his choosing.
Anytime. That is shocking. Anytime.
Yes. And he has chosen deliberately not to end it. He said 24 hours. He may not have been able to get the conflict to end in 24 hours, but he could have laid out decisions in 24 hours, much less than 24 hours, that would have eventually ended the conflict over the course of weeks or maybe a month or two. Obviously has no interest in doing this. And people have to think he's openly talking about confronting China. And I don't mean a business competition. He's sailing warships between Taiwan and the rest of China. He's still building up the military. He's still positioning everything that had been going on under the Biden administration. He's seizing control of the Panama Canal. He's doing all of these things for actual war with China, not competition, not economic competition, actual war. Everything the US is doing is leading up to this. The whole point of getting Europe to step in is because the US has exhausted its stockpiles. They need certain weapons in Asia Pacific to provoke and confront China, like the Patriot missile system. They cannot afford to send any more of these to Ukraine. So this is why this is happening. It's not because of President Trump's benevolence and his desire for peace. He's pivoting to a much larger, more dangerous war, but a war that is equally unwarranted, uncalled for, unnecessary, and predicated on the exact same principles that provoked this current war with Russia. By the way, do people remember that President Trump played an equal hand in preparing for and provoking this war during his first administration? So I just don't get how people are adding all of this up to President Trump wants peace when he's openly preparing to pivot for a war that is all part of it. Russia is connected to China. This is all about encircling and containing both Russia and China. I just don't get how it's adding up for other people. They're telling you what they're doing, and they're openly doing it.
Well, that gets to, I think, the next segment that I wanted to cover, and perhaps we can cover them together. So we have, on the one hand, I don't know if you saw this, Brian, Vladimir Zelensky. Of course, you saw what happened to him in Washington, the absolute just humiliation by Donald Trump to him during their meeting over a so-called minerals deal. He had to leave early before signing. But now it says Trump allies and aides are holding secret talks with Zelensky's Ukrainian opponents as Washington ramps up its pressure on Zelensky to step aside. His rivals are talking to Trump's team. 4 senior members of Trump's entourage have held secret discussions with some of Kiev's top political opponents to Zelensky. So for example, leader Yulia Tymoshenko, a remorselessly ambitious former prime minister, and senior members of the party of Petro Poroshenko, Zelensky's immediate predecessor. And then, Brian, I want to show you, I don't know if you saw Trump's recent announcement regarding NATO. And here it is. Trump considering a major NATO policy shift, possibly favoring members of the alliance that spend a set percentage of their GDP on defense. And it says here, as part of the potential policy shift, the U.S. might not defend fellow NATO members attacked if the countries don't meet defense spending thresholds. If Trump does make that change, it would mark a significant shift from a core tenet of the alliance known as Article 5, which says an attack on NATO country is attack on all of them. However, asked about Trump considering making these changes to how the U.S. engages with NATO, a top national security official said in a written statement, Trump is committed to NATO in Article 5. Senator Chris Coons, a top Democrat, said Trump's nominee of U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, gave very reassuring answers on the administration's commitment to NATO in Article 5. So your comments, Brian, because right now, of course, Zelensky seems to be on the outs. I wouldn't be shocked by this. And there is this move being considered to further lessen supposedly the U.S.'s role in NATO. But talk about your thoughts on this. How does this impact? Because a lot of people will say, well, look, Brian, Trump is making moves to change the calculus in Ukraine and move closer to Russia's side of the equation.
But I think this touches on probably what is Exhibit A, that tells you that the Trump administration is not serious about peace. It stands for continuity of agenda. Again, Secretary Hegseth also said this in Brussels, that all NATO members need to raise the amount of money they are spending on NATO from 2% to 5%. And they're paying 2% because President Trump, under his first administration, told them to, and they complied. And now he's telling them to spend 5% of their GDP on NATO. Why? What is NATO? What does it exist to do? What is the purpose of NATO? It is not a defensive alliance. It is an extension of US foreign policy, and more specifically, its pursuit of hegemony around the world. The only thing it has ever done is pursued wars of aggression well beyond the borders of NATO member states. We remember Libya, that was NATO. Afghanistan, that was NATO. And all of these other wars that the US has gone into and Europe has followed are all de facto NATO. They may not have invoked NATO while going off to war, but they were all NATO members, and it was all being done as a collective operation, essentially a NATO operation. Even if they didn't say it was, that's what it was. Iraq, Syria. So that alone tells you that the Trump administration is not serious. The whole root of this conflict with Russia over Ukraine is NATO's existence, its purpose, which is to encircle, contain, and eventually absorb Russia itself, and the fact that it has constantly encroached upon and along Russia's borders, absorbing nations one after the other, and then transforming them into battering rams to be used against Russia directly. I constantly bring up the 2003 overthrow of Georgia, and from 2003 to 2008, its militarization by the US, arming and training the Georgian military, and then the Georgian military, according to the EU, its own investigation, attacking Russian peacekeepers in 2008, precipitating that very short but very concerning war. It was a US proxy war with Russia using Georgia as a battering ram. And then from 2014 onward, the US did the exact same thing with Ukraine, including under the first Trump administration. They did the exact same thing. And now here's the Trump administration saying, I want peace around the globe. I don't want to fight with Russia, but I'm also going to continue to expand NATO, which is a dagger that exists solely to point at Russia's throat. We're going to sharpen it. We're going to make it bigger, and we're going to continue pointing it at Russia. So how do people reconcile the rhetoric of wanting peace and the reality of creating all the implements to continue war? It just does not add up. It doesn't add up at all. And this talk about exempting NATO members if they're not spending enough of their GDP, I mean, isn't that the perfect way to feed individual European nations into the proxy war with Russia and absolve yourself of Article 5? Isn't that one way that you could do that? Again, Secretary Hegseth in February 12th in Brussels, talking about European peacekeepers in Ukraine and not under the NATO umbrella, and no Article 5 obligation, because what the US wants to do is feed these other countries into the conflict. They're out of Ukrainians. They're going to feed more people in, and they want to absolve themselves of Article 5 because they themselves don't want to get in a direct war with Russia and Ukraine, because they have a war to prepare for and provoke with China in Asia Pacific. So it is laid out in the open. It is obvious for all to see, but people prefer not to look at it and not to accept it because it's very unpleasant.
Yeah, and this whole idea of the U.S. Lessening its support for certain members of NATO who don't increase their spending, that is still the United States in NATO. That is still the United States asserting an incredible level of control actually over NATO.
Yes.
And so talk about this, especially in the context of this spending. Maybe you can help people understand, okay, well, where would this spending go if this spending actually does increase from NATO members, as Trump has been demanding?
I mean, it's going to go to the joint US-European arms industry. All of these companies are interconnected. They, the board of directors, they all play musical chairs from one company to the other on both sides of the Atlantic. And so they're just, again, it's this whole process of pursuing power and profit over any sort of purpose. They're not actually going to make the the moves necessary to significantly expand military industrial production, which would just essentially require nationalization. They'll never do that. But they're certainly going to help themselves to all this money. I think they genuinely believe that there's a way they can do it profitably. And this is all that they talk about in Congress, in the think tanks, all of these people that President Trump is supposedly fighting against and uprooting. They're all the people talking about actually doing this, things that the Trump administration is actually laying out and trying to achieve. So, you know, it's going to be more of the same. Unfortunately, I mean, I wish that I'm here in Asia. I'm on the receiving end of U.S. hegemony, America's pursuit of primacy. It's interference in other countries, despite U.S. aid and NED being dismantled. It continues uninterrupted. So I don't know how it was dismantled, because it's continuing. When you dismantle something, it doesn't exist anymore. It still exists. It exists as bad as ever. And so I wish this was coming to an end, but clearly it isn't. It is continuing.
You know, a lot of people rightfully dislike Volodymyr Zelensky. I certainly don't have any love for Volodymyr Zelensky. What's interesting, though, is that Donald Trump appears to be taking great effort right now, engaging in great effort to essentially conduct regime change against Volodymyr Zelensky. What exactly is the purpose of this, and what is the play here? Because Zelensky says he's bending the knee, or at least he is willing to Donald Trump. He wants to meet about the Middle East. He wants to talk about peace. They're going to supposedly talk about peace in Saudi Arabia. But yet Trump is pursuing his political opposition. So what's the point of this, Brian?
Scapegoating. I mean, and look how well it works. Look at how Trump supporters are watching the Trump administration beat up on Zelensky. It's so satisfying to watch the Trump administration beat up on Zelensky, mock and ridicule and belittle these European leaders that for the last 3 years have played such a visible role in this proxy war against Russia. It makes it more convincing, possibly, for I personally, I know Russian people, I know Chinese people, I know people who live in China who are buying all of this. They completely believe that President Trump is changing everything. The wars are coming to an end, and America is looking for a constructive role to play in the multipolar world. They're actually believing it because of this performance. In reality, if President Trump is talking to Timoshenko and Poroshenko, these are interchangeable with Zelensky. They are creations of the National Endowment for Democracy, all of the Soros-funded foundations that work hand in hand with the U.S. government, including the current U.S. government, the current U.S. Department of State. The Soros-funded organizations are working hand in hand with President Trump's Department of State, headed by Marco Rubio. So how is this change? How is it changed to get these other sock puppets that the U.S. itself created and has used to create this problem? What are you solving? What are you doing by bringing them back in? I mean, I know a lot of people left Ukraine, but is it so depleted of people? These two people are your only choices. So again, if people really apply critical thinking, you can see they're just scapegoating Zelensky. Someone has to take the blame. They're going to blame Zelensky. They're going to shift all of this onto Europe. They're going to play games to try to divide people, force people to rally around equally unpalatable choices, rather than realize that all of this is theater. It is continuity of agenda, and everyone on all sides should oppose it. So they're distracting you away from doing that.
Yeah, well, that's been one of the most troubling, I think, parts of, because on the one hand, I acknowledge because we have had a Biden administration, even the first Trump administration, despite all the rhetoric, moving further and further toward escalation. I can acknowledge that in the beginning, in this first month plus, the Trump administration, yes, has not sent more weapons to Ukraine, has not, has been moving toward talks. All of this very early engagement, indicating that there will be negotiations with Russia. However, the narrative about how these negotiations are going to take place, why they are taking place, has the United States operating as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine. That's how Hegseth talks about it. That's how Trump talks about it. That's how the entire Trump administration talks about it, as if they're not the root cause of the issue. NATO, it's as if they aren't NATO. NATO is the United States, that they are NATO. Zelensky, as if Zelensky isn't the United States. Zelensky wouldn't, if there wasn't a war that the United States supported like it did, Zelensky would have been thrown in the trash a long time ago. So this is all to say that your comments on this part of it, because this narrative is troubling, because I think a lot of people are going to begin to wash their hands, and that's what I see Trump trying to do, wash his hands of this conflict, which, fine, for political purposes, I think he has to do that. I don't think actually that's a position of strength for him. On the other hand, it leaves a lot of room for maneuvering, which can keep a lot of the machinery intact that caused this whole thing in the first place. Your thoughts?
I mean, if you're delegating responsibility for the conflict to your proxies, then you're not actually washing your hands of it. You're just making it look like you've washed your hands of it. And again, like I'm trying to point out to people, President Trump did this regarding Syria. They lost, the US had at that time lost, for all intents and purposes, they lost the proxy war. And so President Trump washed his hands of it. But of course, the weapons, the training, the intelligence, the preparations continued, just covertly. Turkey is a NATO member. It answers to the United States. It has been, and it has taken on this conflict in Syria, which is continuing to this day, by the way. There's been an outbreak of fighting just over this last week. And it is a drain for Turkey. So why is it doing it? Why does it want to do this? So this is how the U.S. has always operated. It creates proxies, and it gets the proxies to absorb all of the downfalls of all of these policies. And if there are any benefits at all to be had, the U.S. enjoys them. And so that's actually what they're doing. They're not really washing their hands. All of this continues. Again, people have to ask themselves, who created the EU? For what purpose? It was so the US could exercise political control over Europe. The special interests that drive everything the EU does, these are US interests that drive these policies. And so unless you talk about those interests, and those interests are targeted and changed, say the Trump administration said, I'm going to actually go after Lockheed, Boeing, BlackRock, Pfizer. I'm going to go after all of these corporations. I'm going to dismantle them. Then maybe you might be onto something. But in actuality, he's working together with all of them, and very overtly, almost cartoonishly in some cases. So no, nothing is changing. They're shifting blame. They're scapegoating. It's a proxy war that has failed at this juncture. It is a failure. It is failing. And the U.S. is simply salvaging it. And they're scapegoating, and they're shifting responsibility because they're looking at the bigger picture. It's not just Ukraine. They're not just trying to win in Ukraine. They're trying to overextend Russia. So whether they won or not in Ukraine, they have achieved that. They are overextending Russia. But their goal ultimately, in the big picture, is China. They are utterly obsessed with China. And all of this is ultimately aimed at China. The whole reason they're trying to undermine and overstretch Russia is to weaken its ability to help China when the U.S. begins openly confronting, or already is confronting China, but confronting it more aggressively.
Yeah, I mean, what stops, given everything that Donald Trump has said here, Brian, what stops Europe from, well, on the one hand, Europe is going to have a hard time, NATO is going to have a hard time with its capacity, the United States too. That's a big point here, is that this has been a lost conflict. So Trump is retreating. And I can acknowledge that. This is a retreat. This will be a legitimate retreat. But what stops NATO if the United States is maneuvering like this? What's up NATO from still being an instrument of provoking Russia when you have the strong rhetoric. You have Europe using stronger rhetoric now as a ploy against Donald Trump than it had even during the Biden administration, because they all agreed on everything, but now they're using stronger rhetoric. So what then stops Europe from playing that role, which will be to the US's benefit against Russia? And then the US has more opportunity and room to do what it wants elsewhere, which seems to be the ploy here, the play. It seems to be where things are going, Brian.
Yes, if you imagine NATO as a sharpened dagger pointed at Russia's throat, what the U.S. is basically doing is just handing it to Europe and saying, you guys hold it, because I have to create a dagger and point it at China's throat in Asia Pacific. This isn't, I'm sorry for what I did, I want this to end. The Trump administration is claiming all of this. Oh, this is Biden's war. This is Zelensky's war. I had nothing to do with it. Maybe even acknowledging that it's because of NATO expansion, but then your actual policy is to further expand NATO. It's just not genuine. It is theater. It is to convince the public. It is to pander to the public. If you look at some of these comments, I mean, it's obviously working. It's powerful propaganda. People for 3 years so desperately wanted to see people like Zelensky or Ursula von der Leyen or whoever is running the UK at the moment, or Macron. All of these people get their comeuppance, and it appears as if Trump is doing that. But in reality, he's talking about expanding NATO funding. I mean, if you really wanted to end this conflict, you would make this about dismantling NATO. You talk about dismantling US aid, which didn't actually happen, or the NED, which also didn't happen. Dismantle NATO. That would prove that you were serious about peace with Russia. Because the only reason it exists is to antagonize, encroach upon, and ultimately absorb Russia. So it all comes down to that. If you are having trouble navigating the rhetoric, the policies, you don't want to believe that Secretary Hegseth literally laid all of this out, that Europe is now obediently to the letter complying with. If you cannot figure any of that out, just go to NATO and the fact that the US is expanding it. That tells you everything you need to know. And I haven't heard anyone explain at all why the Trump administration would be doing this if they were genuinely interested in peace and actually changing the course of American foreign policy, rather than trying to reorganize it because they've run into this brick wall, as the U.S. has done at many junctures, not just now. Again, we were just talking about under the Obama administration. They hit a brick wall during the previous Bush administration, so they pretend to do a reset, all while they get ready for the next round. That is exactly what the Trump administration is doing now.
Key word there seems to be is reorganization, because I think these are fair questions people should be asking. Why doesn't Trump just leave NATO? If he left NATO, NATO would go poof. NATO would not really exist. It would be very difficult for the European so-called used to be, I guess, allies, if we look at the optics of all of this. But if we look at the European NATO members, it would be very difficult for them to maintain the legitimacy of that organization, given the US's outsized role in it. Why doesn't Donald Trump just Russia? I get it. Russia is going to engage with the United States because they can only benefit from any kind of thaw in relations, even if it is just short term, because I think they're quite aware that at any point that could change, whether it's political changes in the United States or whether it's just Trump doing an about face. It could happen at any point. So I understand that, but at the same time, what stops Trump from not just pulling Ukraine aid, pausing it, but what just stops him from saying, well, this is it. We don't want to waste our military resources. We don't want to fight this proxy war anymore. They're saying all of it, but they're going to enter into negotiations, Brian, as a poser of the role of mediator. And I just find that to be shocking, because the United States regime, its military apparatus, its war machinery started this whole thing. So it's just shocking to see it play mediator. Your final comments on this?
Well, you know, like we've already just said, Danny, the first 24 hours of the Trump administration, he could have just came out and he could have just said, I'm pulling the plug on everything for Ukraine and NATO. We're done. We're walking away from this. This was Biden's war. We had nothing to do with it, even though that's a lie. We had nothing to do with it, and we're just pulling the plug on everything. I have not heard an explanation from Trump supporters as to why he didn't do that. Why didn't he do this? He pulled the plug supposedly on U.S. aid, causing all of this chaos. Like not even a grace period or anything, just pulled the plug completely, supposedly, and let everything fall where it may. But he wouldn't do this in regards to the American proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. Why not? Why not just do it? What would have the consequences have been? As President Trump said in his address to Congress, the U.S. has an ocean between it and Europe, a whole ocean. So how is it its problem? It's not its problem, except for the fact that this is ultimately a U.S. proxy war, and the intention is not to actually end it, but to divide the labor in regards to it. And it is not just a proxy war against Russia, it's a proxy war against China, but also against multipolarism in general. President Trump himself came out and said he's going to crush BRICS if they try to use any currency other than the US dollar. I mean, who put him in charge of this? Who put the US in charge of this? And how do you hear that rhetoric and not understand that this is still the same American mindset as it always has been, just a different theater performance to try to convince you otherwise, a different face telling you different lies, but it is the same reality that is being covered up. I don't get it. I haven't heard anyone explain it. The one person, and I'm very glad that they're so upset with me that they're financially supporting Danny. Please explain to me why President Trump didn't pull the plug in the first 24 hours. It wouldn't have ended the conflict overnight, but that would have been an action within 24 hours, and he would have made good on his campaign promise. Why did he make this? He's such a straight shooter. He just says what he thinks, but then he didn't do this. Why not? I'm curious to know.
I also want to
send Danny a super chat explaining your thoughts.
Keep it coming, but I also want to acknowledge that there is a law in the books. That was one point that was made. There is a law in the books that says that U.S. presidents can't withdraw from NATO. What stops Donald Trump?
Wait, Danny, who passed that? Do you know? Do you know who proposed that law? Marco Rubio. That's who.
Oh, right.
The Secretary of State under the Trump administration.
Oh, but Marco Rubio has a cross on his head, and he's totally reformed.
He's a good guy. Yes, he's a good guy now.
But that law, what stops the Trump administration from 100? I mean, they have a full mandate with majorities in the Senate and the House. What stops them from pushing hard? Number one priority, ending that corrupt law that keeps the United States in NATO. Instead, Donald Trump's administration, when it's not Donald Trump insulting NATO, keeps saying that they're committed to NATO, that they're actually committed to NATO just being more European-centric than American-centric, yet that still means the United States is in it. And guess what? The U.S. is still the hegemon. The U.S. is still going to be wielding influence. It is true, in my estimation, that Donald Trump wants to seek a pause and a reset, quote unquote, with Russia. But the aims are not only not clear in terms of what's going to happen from here, but from what we know from history, there has not yet been an example of a U.S. president that has talked reset with Russia and actually meant it, unless it was going to benefit them in the long run. And so I think that's what we really have to see play out.
Well, Danny, I have to push back a little bit here. Again, Secretary Hegseth literally said this was the plan. We're out of arms and ammunition. We need to make more. We're not going to win this now. We're out of bullets. We're out of missiles. We have nothing left. So what we need to do is put a pause on this. Plus, China is on the rise. We got to pause this. We got to freeze it. We need European peacekeepers in Ukraine to pause it. Danny, we talked about this on your show last time. Someone has to monitor the line of contact. So obviously it's not a lasting peace. It is a freeze. And then we need to expand arms production on both sides of the Atlantic. So then the next time this starts again, and it will start again, we have enough bullets and missiles to actually win this time. That is what he said. And that is literally what they are now doing. That is what they are doing. President Trump, during his address to Congress, was all about expanding military production, expanding the military, building a huge fleet of ships. We have an ocean between us and Europe. It's not our problem, but we need a giant military and ships to cross the ocean and do what? The same thing America has always done, menace the rest of the planet. It does not seek a constructive role to play within the multipolar world. It seeks to step on. It has been struggling to do so. It is recalibrating its approach to doing so, but that is what it is doing.
Yeah, I definitely see this so far as a apparent retreat in order to attempt another kind of advance. And until I see otherwise, which would be absolutely shocking. I will be the first one on this show to say, well, hey, I was wrong. But
I'd love to be wrong. Yes.
It would be absolutely shocking. And that's why I say all the time, Brian, let's see what that national security strategy is going to say when the Trump administration actually releases it. Everything the Trump administration has done vis-a-vis China so far has been Trump talking off to the side once in a while, but every single document, fact sheet, everything says, well, there's going to be coercion, there's going to be economic war, and there's going to be a buildup of deterrence, as Hegseth constantly says. Deterrence.
Deterrence against, deterrence against what, Danny? I think it's important.
You see it as war. They use deterrence as just war. I mean, that's how I see it.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I thought this was an interesting. I asked myself this question. I thought, what are they deterring? When you really listen carefully to what they're saying, they're talking about America's own violation of their one China policy, which is also a violation of international law regarding the status of Taiwan. Taiwan is part of China. The U.S. acknowledges that and accepts that officially. International law accepts that. Taiwan is not a country. It is not independent. And if it isn't, what is it then? It is part of China. And so what they're trying to do is deter China from exercising sovereignty over their own territory. That's what they're doing. And they're deterring China from being able to adequately respond to the constant and growing military encroachment of the U.S. all along their shores, all across Asia Pacific and beyond. That's what they're trying to deter. They are containing China and they're deterring China from doing anything to stop it. That is what they are saying. That is what is going on here. And that is not a change. That is continuity of agenda.
And I want to now talk about Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, because he responded. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian was very strong on the tariffs. So as people may know, the United States has increased tariffs on China, has paused actually tariffs on Canada and Mexico. But the United States is full on board. I mean, now there's almost 50% plus tariffs on China. But Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth had responded to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson, as well as now the Chinese embassy. He was on Fox News and had this to say, Brian, and I think we have lots to talk about in relation to his comments here that really paints a picture of what a Trump administration foreign policy will look like vis-a-vis China and Russia in the multipolar world. Here we go.
Change gears. As the speech wrapped up last night, this was posted by the Chinese embassy. Quote, "If war is what the U.S. wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we're ready to fight till the end." As Secretary of Defense, how do you take that?
Well, we're prepared. Those who long for peace must prepare for war.
Did the amount of hypocrisy just break your computer, Danny?
With very different ideologies. You mentioned defense spending. They're rapidly
Hold on. Let's do this again because I did have a hiccup. Let's do this again.
I think it's hypocrisy broke your computer. It's too much to handle.
So here is Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and what he had to say on China.
Change gears. As the speech wrapped up last night, this was posted by the Chinese embassy. Quote, if war is what the U.S. wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we're ready to fight till the end. As Secretary of Defense, how do you take that?
Well, we're prepared. Those who long for peace must prepare for war. That's why we're rebuilding our military. That's why we're reestablishing deterrence in the.
I just have to say, those who long for peace must prepare for war. I don't want your comment here, Brian. We should get through it, but let's keep going. But I just want to highlight that there is just
okay.
A shocking statement.
Warrior ethos is because we live in a dangerous world with powerful ascendant countries with very different ideologies. You mentioned defense spending. They're rapidly increasing their defense spending, modern technology. They want to supplant the United States. If we want to deter war with the Chinese or others, we have to be strong. And that president understands peace comes through strength. He also has a great relationship with that gentleman right there, too, Xi Jinping. So where we can partner, where we can cooperate to recognize that we don't want war with China, we don't seek that war, we will. And the president has sought historic peace and historic opportunities. But my job as the Secretary of Defense is to make sure we're ready. We need the defense spending, the capabilities, the weapons, and the posture in the Indo-Pacific, which is something we're very much focusing on.
China has said they're going to up their defense spending 7.2%. And that's supposedly with a struggling economy. We're getting mixed messages on that. As Secretary of Defense, you always want more money. Absolutely. At the same time, Doge is in there cutting back and speeding up the systems, making it more efficient. How much money are you asking for when you talk to the president or when you talk to the Treasury Secretary in this budget? How much more do we need? Because we watched it, the defense spending was not even keeping up with inflation over the last 4 years.
My message has been, I'm both a fiscal hawk and a defense hawk, and I think America First represents both with peace through strength. So Doge is going to cut fat where we need to, and we're going to reprioritize on the right things. So it's not about a fixed dollar amount, Brian. It's about addressing the president's priorities: Golden Dome, southern border, modernization, hypersonics, UUVs, UAVs, the fight of the future against China. They know we're serious, and we're building for that. So
the fight of the future against China. Brian,
yeah, he let it slip, didn't he?
Let's talk about this because there was all kinds of, well, we long for peace. Well, we want a cooperative relationship with China. It sounds very familiar, but we're preparing for war. But the interviewer said, how much more do you need? He didn't say, we don't need more. But he said, we're fiscal hawks. We can cut that, but we need to invest in these priorities. Brian, your thoughts?
Well, first of all, he says, if you want peace, prepare for war. The U.S. has been at constant war throughout its entire history, including all throughout the 21st century, including all throughout the previous Trump administration and all throughout this current Trump administration. President Trump has sent thousands of bombs to Israel to continue annihilating the Palestinian people. The U.S. itself has dropped bombs under the Trump administration on Somalia, Yemen, and Syria that I know of. And up until now, just this week, the Trump administration had been supplying all of the weapons that were on their way to Ukraine, could have stopped it at any moment. He allowed the flow of weapons to continue. He also continued providing intelligence, surveillance, targeting, acquisition information, and reconnaissance to the Ukrainians, not just to carry out HIMARS operations within what was considered Ukraine's 2014 borders, pre-2014 borders, but also deep drone strikes into Russia, which are almost certainly using the US-based Starlink network. So the Trump administration has been at constant war. So what is he talking about? If we want peace, prepare for war. It's more like we pretend we want peace while at constant war. That's what he should have said if he was being honest. And he's talking about peace through strength. Again, the US has been at constant war. If you look at the US vis-a-vis China, there is already a war taking place through proxies. The US maintains a network of terrorist organizations all around the globe that are attacking China, Chinese interests, Chinese-built infrastructure with partner nations, Chinese engineers. There was an attempt on a Chinese ambassador in Pakistan. These are all U.S.-backed militants the U.S. is using to destroy Chinese infrastructure and kill Chinese people. There is already a war taking place at this moment. It continues under the Trump administration. I just posted a video about Secretary of State Marco Rubio, as far as I know, voluntarily chosen by President Trump, condemning Thailand for sending Uyghur terror suspects back to China. And he's saying these are poor, innocent Uyghurs. They're picked on because of their ethnicity and their religion. And because Thailand has done this, Uyghur terrorists are probably going to attack Thailand. I'm not kidding. That is literally what happened. And so this is the Trump administration still deeply involved in this proxy war with China that is already ongoing, already killing Chinese people, already targeting Chinese infrastructure. It continues uninterrupted under the Trump administration. And he's saying, we don't want war with China, but if you really look at what he's saying all China has to do is submit to us in the Indo-Pacific region. Look at a map. America is not located in Asia. It is literally on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. It has to cross an entire ocean to get there and provoke conflict and confrontation with China. They complain in the think tanks about the tyranny of distance because of just how far they have to go to provoke this conflict and pursue this conflict with China. And the US has tens of thousands of troops deployed closer to China than to America's own shores. And in some cases, literally inside internationally recognized Chinese borders. US right now has US troops on Taiwan. Right now, they do. And so how is this a desire for genuine peace? What it is a desire for China to submit to the US, to submit to its encroachment, to submit to the way of governance the US wants to impose on China, which ultimately is a system of control to actually exercise control over China. So this is what he's actually saying. China has every right to defend itself against this encroachment. By the way, the exact same type of encroachment that triggered the war in Ukraine that President Trump is pretending he's so upset about and wants to end. They are pursuing it openly with China right now under the Trump administration, but it is a continuation of what was going on under the Biden administration. I'm not saying that one or the other is better or worse. I'm saying they're all equally as bad. They're all pursuing continuity of agenda. Ultimately, their presidential campaigns were all funded by the same handful of special interests. It's what I'm trying to wake people up to.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you saw, Brian, there was also a shocking development in relation to this, that the consequences of this, some people will say this is simply a Korean situation, but the U.S. military was in live fire drills with the South Korean military, and it ended up, there was an accidental, quote unquote, strike on a residential home because you had, I believe it was fighter jets flying over Korea. This has real consequences. Talk about this, because this is happening. You know, you have on the one hand, you have the Trump administration saying it wants peace. At the same time that Secretary of State is saying prepare for war with China. Donald Trump also essentially said let's just eliminate all of the Palestinians in Gaza. They're conducting the U.S. bombers are flying with Israeli jets, conducting operations, and so this is all happening as Trump is pivoting away from Ukraine. So talk about this overall, you call it continuity of agenda, but I think a lot of people are getting very caught up in a very early phase of things. Talk about this longer term issue. We even just have tariffs on China immediately. They're the ones that aren't getting paused. So there's obviously something going on with China. Trump definitely has his sights set on China, Canada, Mexico, all of them have been delayed, but not China.
I'll start with this incident in South Korea. This is actually one of the things that woke me up and got me out of the U.S. military. I've been in the U.S. Marines since I was 17 years old, and it's pretty much everything that I saw upon joining contradicted everything that I thought the U.S. stood for. And when I came to Thailand, the very first time was for a joint U.S.-Thai military exercise called Cobra Gold. And I remember the U.S. shooting artillery rounds, 100-pound artillery rounds over people's houses. And I was like, how are you allowed to do this? We would never be allowed to do. Japan would never, as submissive as Japan is, they would never allow the U.S. to do that there. And certainly in the U.S., you would never do that. So why are we firing these live rounds over people's homes? You could hear them buzzing overhead. And we were firing on machine gun and rifle ranges with washed out berms in the back that were supposed to, basically catch the bullets. And I was like, do we even know what's beyond that we might be shooting at? The U.S. officer in charge didn't care at all. So this is something the U.S. always does. They don't care. They don't care about these people. They're not actual allies. They're proxies to be used. They have no interest in their safety or their protection. Ultimately, if it meant advancing U.S. interests, they would feed every single last one of them into proxy war, kind of like what they're doing with Ukraine. So that I just wanted to talk about that. I mean, it's a continuation of what has always been going on. It was one of the things that actually originally woke me up to what the U.S. really was versus what I had believed it was. President, I wanted to point this out also, Danny. I forgot to mention this. Hegseth is talking about maybe they need to expand the U.S. budget. The U.S. spends more on military than like the next 9 or 10 countries combined, including Russia and China. And so they're talking about China expanding their military budget, but compared to the U.S. budget, it's still a tiny fraction of what the U.S. itself spends. And again, if you actually look at what the U.S. is doing to China, it is in direct reaction to what the U.S. is doing to China right off their own shores and even within their own borders. Again, he himself said it in Brussels. They are losing the proxy war in Ukraine. They are out of bullets. They are out of missiles. They don't have anything left to send. They need to put a pin in it for now, get Europe to step in, and they need to pivot over to China because China is advancing rapidly. If you look at the actual policy papers that underpin President Trump's foreign policy, like the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, or the Trump administration Connected America First initiative, all they talk about is confronting and containing China, and which is all the Biden administration talked about and worked toward doing, which is all previous administration, the previous Trump administration, Obama for 8 years. Before that, China was still relatively small and not really on the U.S. radar. But again, it is obviously continuity of agenda, and China is reacting to this, but it's ultimately the U.S. provoking this, including right now under the Trump administration. So he's the peace candidate, but he is working on preparing and provoking an even worse war than he did when he was president the first time, when he was arming Ukraine and preparing for and provoking that war, which eventually unfolded. Was there another question, Danny? I got lost when I was talking about South Korea.
No. Oh, well, it was, the war on China is not talked about as much right now. The United States has been embroiled and has lost the Ukraine conflict. And so for, viewers who are very angry at a position like, well, maybe we should be far more critical and cautious of what actually is going to happen with vis-a-vis the United States to Ukraine. I actually think that there could be a settlement on Ukraine. Very much could be. Only, though, in my opinion, only if it benefits Russia's side to the largest extent possible. But even if there is a peace settlement, that doesn't necessarily mean that peace is going to, one, hold or even break out. It could it could still mean a reorientation, especially since all of the early moves indicate reorientation. But with China, there has not been any reorientation. There hasn't been even a single move by the Trump administration to do that, other than some vague, oh, we're going to make a trade deal with China. They did that. They did that in the first administration. They did the trade deal, and the trade deal ended up being leveled with economic war policies, from tariffs to sanctions, and U.S.-China trade actually was really hurt by that. So, let's talk about that, Brian. Because you talk about the whole picture of the war on China. Talk about where it is right now and where it's going, given Trump's early moves.
Well, the tariffs are designed specifically to decouple from China on America's terms. They know that when they provoke this conflict with China, trade is going to stop. And so if they are heavily dependent on China and they don't do anything to decouple before that, it'll be a disaster for the United States. So the tariffs, President Trump himself said during his address to Congress, I don't know if people caught it, but he said it's going to be something like it's going to be uncomfortable or unpleasant in the beginning, but trust him, it'll get better later on, like it did after his first term in office, right? The whole purpose of the tariffs is to start this decoupling incrementally on America's own terms, so that they can separate as much as possible from China to reduce the shock when they finally do get into conflict with China. And only because the U.S. is determined to get into conflict with China, because it is unwilling to accept a nation with a larger population, 4 to 5 times larger industrial base, plenty of resources, the best infrastructure on earth. They're unwilling to accept that a nation like that will just inherently have more power and influence globally. There's no reason why they shouldn't. And there's no reason for the U.S. to be alarmed over this. It is not a threat to the U.S., only a threat to U.S. hegemony well beyond America's own borders. This is what they're fighting over. This is what they are upset about. This is what they claim is at risk. Notice how they always very deliberately throw in American interests. They pretend as if China threatens the U.S. within its borders, but if you read the think tank papers, they admit that that's not true. The only thing China threatens is America's interests all around the world, in other people's countries within their borders, where the U.S. has no business interfering in the first place. And Danny, you're 100% right. Nothing has changed in regards to China. The Biden administration was building up the U.S. Marine Corps specifically as an anti-shipping force to use against China. And now here's President Trump seizing all the maritime choke points, the Panama Canal, Greenland, the Arctic Sea route. They even connected it to maritime trade routes. So that's not me imagining that. That's the Trump administration admitting that. And by the way, I don't know if you were going to get to this, Danny, but what did he announce during his address to Congress, this address that everyone is praising? An American company has begun purchasing the ports on either side of the Panama Canal. Which American company, why wouldn't you mention? It's such a great American company. Why wouldn't you? He was giving the spotlight to so many other Americans. Why not this great American company? It's BlackRock, which is the deep state. It is the deep state. The founder, Larry Fink, he works with USAID. BlackRock and USAID work together. USAID will take American tax dollars, invest in like a wind farm project in Kenya, and then BlackRock would come in and privatize all of the profits coming out of it. And there's no plan ever to transfer it over to the people of Kenya, actually. This is exactly what they accuse China of, even though China, in all of their agreements, they always transfer the infrastructure back to the host nation once they make their investment back. BlackRock is just like a parasite, just feeding off of all of these U.S. taxpayer-funded investments. Larry Fink also sits on the board of directors of the International Rescue Committee, which is just a fake humanitarian organization. It's basically a privatized version of USAID, but it also was getting funded by USAID. So That is the deep state. President Trump is working hand in hand with the deep state. So I just don't get why people see this. And like a lot of people aren't even talking about it. They're just pretending that that didn't happen because that is inconvenient. How do you explain that? If you're talking about Trump, a revolutionary, wrestling the deep state to the ground, it doesn't look like they're wrestling to me. Looks like they're doing something else.
Fink, the executive of BlackRock, called Donald Trump personally, actually, to make this deal. It was his idea. He got a couple of ports out of it. BlackRock will now control these ports in Panama, and it's not over yet. The Trump administration, all of the right-wing media, quote unquote, they're all saying that this is just phase one. The Trump administration saying this is just the beginning of what is going to be an ongoing. And this is provocative. I mean, China just made one of the strongest statements you will ever hear come out of China's foreign ministry from its spokesperson. We are ready for any kind of war with the United States. China's, and people, I know you said people Brian, have been very enthusiastic. When I was last in China, there were people who were enthusiastic about Trump, getting almost getting assassinated and all that. But in terms of people who really matter, who are like making decisions and who have any connection to them, people who have any understanding of what they think in China that I've talked to, they're like, they know that this is all, I have contacts over here at the embassy. They know. They're like, we know that things are going to get hairy. They would just be happy for however long of a period it takes to get there, because the Trump administration obviously has the U.S. empire being outstretched. And at any point, it could get pulled in a direction it either doesn't want to go in or it wants to go in, and will be completely mired into that. I'm thinking here, West Asia, that could become another cauldron for the Trump administration at any point, given the U.S.'s dedication and loyalty to Israel, which Trump is very much, definitely on that bandwagon. There's no doubt about it. But Brian, I want you to definitely, when it comes to BlackRock, that's Wall Street. And Wall Street is the deep state, and the deep state is going to be driving China policy here. What do you see coming down the bend? We have the Panama Canal situation, but what else do you see coming down the bend as we move toward this pivot?
Well, the U.S. and again, I highly suggest people do it at least once. Go and just one time listen to one of these 3 to 5 hour. I know it's a long time, but these 3 to 5 hour hearings that they do in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, talking about confronting, countering China or the defense industrial base or U.S. aid, and listen to them. Listen to how fundamentally Republicans, Democrats, pro-Trump, anti-Trump, they are all on the same page. They are all pro-American hegemony. They are all pro-corporate America. They are all pro-corrupt, deeply entrenched monopolies, because those corrupt, deeply entrenched monopolies put all of them into office, including Trump, by the way, just so you know, and all the people that surround him. I remember listening to now Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth during his confirmation hearing. And we probably talked about this last time, Danny, but maybe not for people that weren't here. That someone was asking him, you said, Mr. Hegseth, that you want to ban U.S. generals from retiring and immediately going into the military-industrial base, basically, working for these arms manufacturers because of the conflict of interest involved. Are you going to hold yourself to the same standards? And he could not say no. He would not say no. And eventually his answer was, well, I'm not a general. Yes, you're only Secretary of Defense. So why would you have to avoid conflict of interest? Which tells me he already has something lined up that he's worried will obviously become public once he's done with his stint. And he will have essentially lied during the hearing, which, you're really not supposed to do. And so these are the type of people that we are pinning our hopes on. These are people that you should not pin any hope on at all. They are telling you their intentions are nefarious. They're telling you they are lying to you if only you listen carefully. Actually, you don't even really have to listen carefully. As Daddy pointed out, thousands of bombs being sent to Israel. For what? For what? How is this America's business? Again, it's on the other side of the planet. Why is this America's business? And I even hear Trump supporters say, well, yeah, maybe his policy on Israel really doesn't add up. Of course it doesn't, and none of it adds up. That one is just the most obvious, but all of his other policies make just as little sense if you really apply critical thinking, if you stop being persuaded by the emotional theater, which is designed specifically to achieve this, to get you to turn off your critical thinking, to suspend disbelief. It's our guy now, and he's a good guy. He's not going to do anything wrong. Well, if you pay attention closely, he is. He obviously is. The administration obviously is. Dan, you asked, what is coming? What is coming is the same thing that has been coming. There's this confrontation with China coming. They are preparing for it. They prepared for it under the Biden administration, the first Trump administration, 8 years of Obama. They're building up the U.S. military specifically to confront China. They know they can't take them on head on, so they are preparing to utilize America's global spanning military infrastructure to cut off Chinese maritime shipping and isolate and cripple the Chinese economy. That is exactly what they're doing with Panama, Greenland, many other things, the whole reorganization of the U.S. Marine Corps, unprecedented. They got rid of all of their tanks. They no longer have tanks because they are solely designed now to fight an anti-shipping war with China. It is coming. The signs are all there, open. It's being done open, out in the open. People just have to look and see. Secretary of State Marco Rubio interfering in Thai-Chinese relations in defense of literal terrorists is a warning sign. Secretary Rubio butting in over Taiwan. The fact that the U.S. State Department's website on U.S.-Taiwan relations has erased the sentence, we do not recognize Taiwan independence. We do not support Taiwan independence. They have erased that because that is the direction they are going toward, compelling the puppet regime in Taipei to declare independence and provoke war with China. That is what is coming. People need to get ready for it.
And what's so incredible about that, Brian, is, the U.S. is truly a destroyer. When we think about the U.S. empire, I don't care. I will definitively say that the Trump administration, just like the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, in my opinion, just because this is just how it goes, it gets worse and worse and worse. And people don't expect anything. So when things get worse and worse and worse, people are like, oh, if anything is better, even just on the surface, if you can just see, oh, well, this is just better, right? Talks with Russia are better. Yeah, it is true. Like, I believe that. I am 100% like, yes, talking to Russia is better than what we had before. However, that doesn't mean that the policies are substantively going to change. I've always been of the assessment that what the United States does is it tries to become a more effective arbiter and agent of empire. And we just happen to have a president of Biden who literally couldn't, because of his own issues, because of the state of the empire, because of what transpired on October 7, 2023, because of so many things. Biden couldn't be a more effective arbiter of empire. He actually was a much less effective. So the Ukraine conflict, I didn't even mention that, right? Like being the president that stepped into that. He just happened to be there and step into that. And yes, he was a big part of facilitating it. But that, we are in a period where the United States empire is going to make things work. We're entering recession, or we're really we basically are in a recession. Even on Taiwan, this notion of the U.S. helping Taiwan or aiding Taiwan, any of this, Donald Trump is both saying, on the one hand saying, well, China is the biggest threat, and on the other is pulling away Taiwan's economic lifeline from it in order to try to compete with mainland China. And that is what is so astounding, is that no matter what happens here, it doesn't mean things get better. For actually, it could mean that things get worse for people, like what's about to happen to the Chinese on Taiwan, when there's a redirection of investment where they're going to be paying a whole lot more money coming over here to the United States to invest their chip making industry here than in Taiwan, and building better relations with the mainland. So it's a destroyer. But I wanted Brian to get to a few questions from the audience before we head out of here.
Sure. Can I just say one more thing about
Sure.
Taiwan? Why do people think they're moving chip production off of Taiwan? Do you read the think tank papers where they say any conflict we provoke with China over Taiwan is going to scour the surface of the island of all industry, all infrastructure, a good portion of human life? They're preparing to burn it to the ground just like they did to Ukraine. So they're taking all the little valuable bits, stealing it away essentially, coercing Taiwan, the companies based in Taiwan to do this before they burn it down. It's so obvious. It's so obvious. And this is happening, continuing. It was happening under Biden. It's continuing under Trump, uninterrupted. That's all I wanted to say, Danny.
No, of course. So everybody, we're going to get to the audience questions. If you want to leave a question, please do leave a super. We've had a lot of generosity tonight, and I do appreciate all of it. The evening crowd actually tends to be far more generous than the daytime crowd, even when viewership might be a little lower. So appreciate and thank all of you, including those who were sparring with Brian in the chat. We might get to one or two of those questions. I think the person who was sparring with you, Brian, might have left. So that's unfortunate. Yes. I don't know if they had any questions though, but I will ask the first question from this person here. If America and Russia sign an extensive natural resources deal and Europe implodes, doesn't that benefit America geopolitically?
What does the U.S. need rare earth minerals for? You use it for telecommunication equipment, which the U.S. doesn't manufacture. You also use it for weapons, which the U.S. does manufacture. So what do they need all of this for in the first place? To build more weapons. To build more weapons to do what? To the next time they fight a proxy war with Russia, they can win. Or the next time they fight a conflict here in Asia, they will win. That's the reason why they need these rare earth minerals. This is all they talk about. Again, Republican, Democrat, neocon, pro-Trump, anti-Trump. This is all they talk about in the Senate and the House of Representatives. So surely Russia knows this. I think Russia is playing devil's advocate. I think they're playing along with it, just like you say, Danny. I know a lot of people in Russia and China, not like in the government, but just people in general who are falling for this. But I believe the governments they obviously have to know that this is a ruse, and they're playing along with it because in many ways it kind of boxes America in too. I mean, the U.S. is trying to box Russia in, and Russia is trying to do the same, vice versa.
Yeah, and Russia only gains from engaging in any kind of diplomacy with the United States, and a big part of that gain is actually it destroys the narrative that Russia is losing, that Russia is being defeated on the battlefield, that Russia has been forced to the table, that there's anything that can force Russia to. No, actually, it's the United States that is requesting this. It's the United States that is saying it wants this. Regardless of how it turns out, it could fall through. It could very well not lead to anything. There may not be a ceasefire. There may not be a peace deal. There may not be anything. But if Russia engages, then it only benefits them, especially in the eyes of the world, which has been a big project for Russia. Obviously, we talked about this many times on the show. Big project for Russia is to not look like, because they aren't, because the Russian government doesn't operate the same way as the United States does geopolitically or in terms of how it builds relations and operates globally. So why would it reject anything? Even if, I mean, come on, I would be frustrated if I was on the Russian side and having to hear the Trump administration talk about peace, but essentially guarantee that this is going to be a huge, long process that will take months and months probably to come to any kind of resolution. But do you have any comments on that, Brian?
No, I think you summed it up perfectly.
So Brian, if Zelensky isn't, and thank you, Sparky. Also, thank you to Fuzzy Balls. A lot of fuzzy balls in that picture of theirs. If Zelensky isn't the legitimate leader of Ukraine, what right does he have to sign over mineral rights to the U.S.? Isn't the whole rare earth saga being used as a plot device in the narrative?
I think so. I mean, how is Ukraine extracting anything from anywhere? All their infrastructure has been ravaged. A lot of the rare earth minerals are in territory that Russia currently has incorporated into the Russian Federation. Also, I mean, just think about, and I don't understand why Trump supporters aren't getting this. The U.S. just burned Ukraine to the ground in this proxy war. President Trump, maybe he doesn't want to admit his own role, but he admits that the Biden administration provoked this war. I just heard, I forget which one it was, but they admitted that it was a proxy war. Maybe Waltz or one of them admitted that it's a proxy war, a U.S. proxy war against Russia. They admitted that much. I mean, that's astounding that they would admit this. But then this mineral deal, let's just pretend that it was going to happen, and billions of dollars of minerals were going to be extracted, or the wealth extracted from Ukraine to the United States. You just burned the country to the ground, and you're sifting through the ashes to steal what hasn't been turned to ash. Who does something like that? That's not something an upright nation interested in peace does. That is what the U.S. really is. That's something they would do. That is something they have always done. That is what they continue doing.
So Brian, we actually have someone who I definitely want to give the floor to, because they've been sent many super chats and wanted to challenge your assertion on things. Samprase1 says, it is obvious Trump is pushing extremely hard towards a peace deal. He threw Zelensky out because of it. Ask it, Danny. Will there be a peace deal? I am 90% certain. Brian.
Like Minsk 3.0? Yes, I think there will be a Minsk 3.0. That's possible. If Russia decides that it benefits from getting a little bit of time, maybe a little bit of a reprieve, even though weapons are still flowing, intel is still flowing. If the U.S. is saying we cut Ukraine off from intel, all of this intel goes to the rest of NATO. So NATO will just send it to Ukraine. And this is exactly what the Trump administration did regarding Syria. They never ended the proxy war. They continued it. They just made it quieter. And that's what's happening here. So a peace deal in which peace is actually achieved? No. The Trump administration is telling you we are pivoting to China to pursue the exact same type of conflict with China. That is not something you do when you're interested in peace. So no, there's no genuine peace deal being arrived at now or ever, as long as these people control the country.
Well, it's going to be very interesting because on the one hand, and this is what I think makes this moment very, in my opinion, a lot of people look at Trump and they say Trump is the agent of history here. I actually don't see that. What I see the agent of history here being is the facts on the ground. And the facts on the ground are that the United States, if you want to say NATO in there too, but U.S. is NATO. So they have been dealt what would have been, what will be if this military operation by Russia continues. It will be the most humiliating defeat. Maybe you could argue, especially since 1945, its worst defeat in its history. Vietnam was incredibly humiliating in many respects, but you know, this would be the first time the United States would have to lick its chops and say, we lost to a superpower. We can't even make excuses. Russia is a big country, and it's the Cold War adversary. At least with Vietnam, there were degrees of separation. Well, we lost that fight in that little country over there. You can't do that with Russia. So it would be incredible. So in that respect, it's going to be very interesting to see Trump try to navigate this, because while I do think a deal could very well be struck, how is Trump and his administration really going to, beyond the rhetoric, really going to handle Russia saying, well, here are our core demands, and these demands are maximalist, and these demands reflect the facts on the ground, and there they are. These are things that are going to be very hard to budge on, especially since the Russian people and however much sacrifices they made, they're expecting that Russia is going to not repeat what they've already said. The Russian government's already said was a big mistake, which is Minsk, which is not going in militarily earlier when there was a chance in 2015, 2014-ish. So I am very curious to see that is where I think a lot of this drama will unfold, because this whole Trump is changing everything, all powerful. I think the lens should be switched from so Trump focused to, well, what does Trump maybe have to be forced to do in order to even pursue that agenda that we've been talking about, that realignment. Some people are calling it reverse Kissinger, but the United States was in a much stronger position in 1972 during the Nixon talks than it is in 2025. So at least from a diplomatic standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from what capacity its military has to, to assert primacy, it's still doing a lot of damage, but it is, it's still very violent. Look at what's happening in Syria right now. But at the same time, its ability to really achieve core objectives is far diminished, and it's going to have to face that fact at the table with Russia. And I will be and I think some of the scapegoating here plays a role in where's the out. Where's the out if things cannot be agreed upon? Your thoughts,
and
Brian?
Danny, you brought up Vietnam. Did the U.S. make a peace deal to end the war, or did they just lose the war and desperately saved face? That's what the U.S. If the U.S. does reach some kind of conclusion like that, that's the reason why. It's not because they're interested in peace. They're openly pivoting to war with China. Openly, they're doing it. They said they are doing it. So these are not people interested in peace. They lost, and they have to reconcile that. That is reality. They cannot deny it any longer. They lost. What they are doing right now is shifting responsibility to Europe. Maybe when Europe, all of this has run its course, then maybe there will be some sort of peace deal. But again, like this person asking the question, Secretary Hegseth said it last month, and Europe is now doing it. Doesn't that register at all? Why are people sidestepping this? I don't understand. I get it. You want to believe that this is going to happen, but wanting to believe something is independent of reality. Now,
a few more questions that you can comment on. I'm gonna put them up, and then you can comment on whatever ones you want. So some press says there's going to be peace with China, in Ukraine within 2 months. There will not be a war on China, but there will be usual economic stuff. Why did he contact Hamas behind Israel's back? So you can comment on any of that. There's this. Why would Taiwan go along with this after the Ukraine disaster? I have Taiwanese friends from Taiwan who say they know they will all die if the U.S. pushes them to war. Why follow the U.S. into destruction? And then regular troops, really? U.S. forces will engage in direct combat with Chinese forces in Taiwan on the mainland. Regular forces are not trained in such a fight. And Denise, stay put, because we're going to close with your question. So, Brian, do you want to comment on any of this?
Well, as far as there's not going to be war with China, the U.S. is openly preparing to go to war with China. Openly, they're not even denying that this is happening. And it was something that has been happening over many years since the Obama pivot to Asia and now the Trump pivot to Asia. I mean, how do you see these things repeating themselves almost verbatim? And you still, I don't want there to be a war with China. I'm in Asia. I'm going to be one of the first people affected by it. I more than anyone don't want. That's why I'm trying to desperately wake people up to the reality that nothing has changed. This is coming. And if you close your eyes, it's going to hurt worse because you're not going to be able to prepare yourself for when it hits. It is coming. They're preparing for it. Nothing has changed. When you see President Trump working with BlackRock to take the Panama Canal from the evil Chinese, I mean, he's making the Chinese out to be the villains. Why do you do that if you're not preparing conflict with China? Just economic stuff? Isn't that how every single war begins? It begins over economics. It begins with a declining empire, losing its hegemony, and it reacts violently. Do you think this will be the first empire in human history that just, we gave it the old college try and we're just going to throw in the towel? We're good guys. At the end of the day, I mean, 4 million dead in Vietnam, 1 million dead in Iraq. We're not even counting in Palestine.
Look at the world wars, Brian, too. Even just the world wars in history. Those are wars for colonies by the Western colonial powers. They fought each other for them. Like this, and it was a lot of that was based on economics, both against each other. And, you know, we know what happened to Germany before the rise of Nazism. Like economically, like the West crushed it. So like after World War I, so yeah, economic wars lead to military conflicts, even just in the recent history. Look at what happened to Iraq. What did the United States do to Iraq? Sanctioned that country to oblivion after bombing it to oblivion during the Gulf War, sanctioned it to oblivion, and then invaded it. So
yes,
it all goes together.
Yes, the U.S. sees warfare as a spectrum, and none of it is separate. So when they go in with the NAD to interfere and undermine a country, this is a form of warfare. Economic sanctions and tariffs, this is a form of warfare. It is a spectrum. It's just a matter of how severe the warfare becomes. If you listen to the actual people coming up with these policies, because I'm telling you, it's not Trump, it's not Hegseth, it's not Rubio. These people are blank slates. They're not coming up with any of this on their own. They're repeating almost verbatim the think tanks, which I implore people to please read them, because if you read it, then you will, when you hear them repeating it, you will be shocked and you will wake up to what is actually going on here. They're talking about this as a form of warfare, and they're saying if this does not work, then we need to resort to actual warfare, because we cannot live in a world where the U.S. is not the dominant power around the globe. We just is unthinkable. We will never accept a preeminent China. It will not even a China that's preeminent just in Asia where it's located on a map. We will not even tolerate that. This is what they are saying, and this is what they are doing. Oh, and there was a question about why would Taiwan go along with this after Ukraine. This is the point of politically capturing a country. You politically capture it, you get a small handful of people who don't care about Taiwan, what will happen to it. So they're the ones steering it over the cliff, because they'll jump out. Everybody else is locked up in the back. They will jump out and be spared, and the whole thing will go over the cliff. And then the U.S., through its propaganda networks, brainwashes the population into going along with this. That is how it happens. And they convince these people. And if you talk to these people, they are convinced that they are different. This time it's different. The people in the Philippines, no matter how many times the U.S. has kicked them while they are down, who had formerly colonized them until after World War II, they think they're different. They think the U.S. is really in their corner. They don't see that they're just another Ukraine, even though they obviously are. So, and it's unfortunate, but that's the reason why.
Yeah. And I'll just say that, you know, under the first Trump administration, there was a lot of talk about there wasn't any new wars, but in fact, there was an escalation of every single one that existed. That could very well be possible. Each time that the Trump administration, that Trump has come in, he actually came in with an essentially a mandate to scale back existing wars that had been expanded, and then now we don't, you know, I think one of the questions was like, oh well, there's not going to be a war on China. I don't believe that there will be a shooting military conflict between the U.S. and China under the Trump administration at this moment. However, to ignore the fact that Trump, Biden, Obama before them, that they have been building up to this point, and that the Trump administration will look, we shouldn't, there's no crystal balls here. We shouldn't act like we know exactly what's going to happen tomorrow or 5 months or 10 months from now. But I think history shows us that the United States is going to continue to militarily encircle China. It's already continuing the economic war. They're talking about increasing defense spending for the purpose of China. If the United States does, which it already is hinting at, that it's going to pivot away from the so-called European theater. Come on, where do you think they're gonna go? Are they gonna? Is everyone going home? Is the military efforts going? No, this happened under Obama. They're Middle East, right? We're gonna take a break from the Middle East, do a couple surges here and there, but by 2011, we'll take a little break. What happened after Libya? What happened? They moved everything to the Asia Pacific. We're gonna take a little break. We just decimated Libya. We started a cauldron and engulfed Syria in a proxy war. But we're gonna take our military and we're gonna move it to the Asia Pacific. And I think the same thing is going to happen here, because there is no questioning this part about it. This part of U.S. foreign policy right now in the Trump administration. Continue. Yeah, you can go, Brian. I'm going to pull up the last question after this.
If you have tens of thousands of troops closer to Chinese shores than America's shores, why are they there except to provoke war? And you could argue, well, he's just keeping them there to negotiate. But then you are admitting that military coercion is part of business and economic competition. Then you are admitting that it is all just one spectrum, and the U.S. is just moving along that spectrum until they get what they want. And if you think they're just going to accept that, well, we're not going to get what we want, and we'll just accept China is the dominant power in Asia, as it should be. It is the largest country in the region, largest population in the world. Why? What is this obsession the U.S. has with China surpassing the U.S.? It is natural, it is normal, and to try to stop it is irrational and abnormal.
Yeah, and this can be our final question, but I'll acknowledge all the supers, because I just want to say, even though, especially for some press, they won, and I want to shout out, even though I know that this person was very angry with you, Brian, Posmo, I want to shout you out too for being so generous to use your supers to
he was very generous
debate.
When I was on Scott of Calibrated's
awesome.
channel. Also,
Please.
very, very generous.
It helps independent media. Yeah, it helps independent media. We need to have these conversations. This is not personal. And if we're wrong, then we're wrong. And Brian, you said it. You want to be wrong.
I want to be wrong.
And I don't, and I'm not going to say we're right here. We're in this period of we are analyzing what's in front of us based on what has happened in the past. I think that's how you should analyze events, and you come to your own conclusions. So here is what Denise had to say: is there still hope, or is the U.S. going to bully us all to annihilation? This discussion is so depressing. See, I want to address this, but Brian, I want to give you the first word. Have a nice weekend. I hope you're still here, Denise.
No, it is depressing. I mean, do people see me and Danny talking about this? Does it seem like we're enjoying ourselves? Again, I'm here in Asia. I just watched Secretary of State Marco Rubio interfere in Thailand's internal political affairs and threaten terrorism against Thailand. When you come out and you defend terrorists, pretending that they are innocent victims out of one side of your mouth, and then out of the other say you might get a terrorist attack because you did this, that is a not so veiled threat. I was here in Thailand the last time Uyghur extremists backed by the U.S. carried out a terrorist attack. It was at a shrine downtown that I used to walk past almost every single day. And it blew up and it killed 20 completely innocent people, body parts dangling from the surrounding trees. Hate to be graphic, but that is reality. This is what the U.S. is really doing. And I see these things. I'm at the receiving end of it. When he said he stopped USAID and NED, I'm watching the NED and USAID funded groups here continue to operate and continue to interfere and to continue to go out onto the streets and disrupt everybody's peace and prosperity. I'm watching it happen in real time. And I'm trying to warn people that we've heard this song and dance before, and we know what the outcome is. And I'm warning you that it's not that it's going to happen. It already is happening. You explain to me why Secretary of State Marco Rubio is as using neocon war propaganda against China regarding the Uyghurs. Absolute lies. I've had people say, "Oh, you're dismissing the abuses of China on the Uyghurs." I spent years exposing that this has never even happened. I've
been there twice.
You've been there, Danny. Yes, it's not happening.
I spent a lot of time over there. Yeah.
It is to China what WMDs was to Iraq. It is a deliberate, transparent lie. If you spend 5 minutes researching it, every single person telling these lies are funded by the US government. And so I thought Secretary Rubio under Trump, he was on Trump's leash and he was going to do whatever President Trump told him to do. It seems like he's the same old Marco Rubio that I warned people he would be. Danny, do you remember when the first rumors that Trump was picking Rubio and people wouldn't even believe it because they're like, what? Again? Neocons again?
And people were rightfully angry.
Yes.
And now because he is on his best behavior, because this is the Donald Trump effect. No, he's not, but he's on in terms of the issues that he is being promoted about, because the Ukraine conflict. The Ukraine conflict, that conflict gets far more attention. So if he does, when he's doing this stuff, taking the thing, taking off the Secretary of State fact sheet about Taiwan, taking it off, doing all that, and what you're saying with the Uyghurs, this stuff is not going to register right now because the Ukraine conflict is everything, and he is on his best behavior on this. They all, you can tell that they all are trying to be on in Trump's. Look at what just happened with Zelensky. Like, that was pure strategic theater to decimate Zelensky's image to the lowest point. It was so obvious that was the ploy, that it was going to be so easy. And while I don't think Zelensky knew, I don't think it was like, oh, I'm coming in here ready to play the part. He already knew, because that, come on, they're all talking, that Trump is not going to do what he wants around Ukraine like that right now. He already knew that Trump was going to say this and that it wasn't going to be a good interaction. That I don't think he expected that he was going to get roasted. But this is kind of what we are being fed right now. We're being fed Trump good on Ukraine, and then everything else is kind of up for grabs. Don't pay attention, and it also reflects the U.S.'s weakness, in my opinion. I want to answer this question about positive, what's happening right now that can be seen as positive, because the United States has no idea what to do with West Asia, with Gaza. I mean, look at the mess in Syria. People are fighting back. People are pissed. And you know what? It's going to be horrific. A lot of people are dying right now. They're going to die. But people are going to fight because why? Well, the United States, NATO, Turkey, Israel, they created a complete and utter disaster there that, just like anywhere else, people are not going to tolerate forever. They're either going to leave or they're going to stay home and fight. And that's what they've learned in that region quite dramatically. But the United States has no idea. I don't think Trump has any idea what to do about that, because he knows what happened to Biden could very well happen to him. If he gets stuck in there, it's not gonna go well for him. People Trump supporters, they don't care. They're so much more inhumane. That doesn't even matter. What matters is what it looks like for the Trump administration to inherit what many people call a genocide if that starts again. It's not going to go well for the Trump administration. The same thing with Ukraine. He's got to do something about it. And regardless of what kind of maneuvering his administration is able to do to make sure the U.S. wins out, no matter what, I think some press once said something in here like Russia may take concessions. I'm not even going to say that's out of the question, but there's no doubt the United States is going to have to, at least at the level of what's on a document and what gets agreed upon, is going to have to take major concessions. Now, what the United States does, that's a whole other question. How they behave, what plays out from there. But I think and then with China, right, the moves that it's making with China, I think while on the one hand, there's significant impact that happens, that damaging impact. It's not It's not pretty. But on the other hand, I think this multipolar world that is emerging and really here and getting stronger, I don't see the Trump administration arresting that. And not only this, I think all of his policies, every single one of them, except perhaps this temporary whatever thaw with Russia, every other policy he pursues is actually going to accelerate the multipolar world, because he's going to start to try to pick on so-called smaller countries, which Republicans always do, especially in Latin America. He's going to start to pick on them. And guess what that's going to do? It's going to, they are also going to want to pursue even stronger ties away from they're going to lose any hope in relations with the United States, and they're going to move closer to the leaders of the multipolar world. I think the inevitability of all of this is that the United States becomes more isolated, even with the policy with Europe. People cheer it. Yeah, screw Europe. Sure. I don't. Europe is a bygone like the Western Europe, NATO. They're all bygone empires. I don't give a crap that Trump is bullying them publicly. I don't care. But guess what? The United States actually needs Europe to maintain its empire. So that's why I don't buy that somehow this, like, similar to you, Brian, like this whole, oh, well, it's Europe's responsibility now suddenly means that the United States is out of the picture, not enforcing its interests. Because if the United States, and maybe I'm wrong, Brian, maybe we're wrong, if the United States truly cuts off Europe, its empire is in big trouble. And I don't buy that Donald Trump wants to see his presidency be a catalyst, a catalyst for the demise of the empire, not simply a temporary retreat or moving chess pieces around, so-called, right? Moving pieces around in the apparatus. No, I actually see this moment as the United States is trying to pursue its unlimited hegemonic interests, what it sees as unlimited, and constantly running into barriers. We can even see that with the tariffs. He has to cancel and delay tariffs on Canada and Mexico because there's something called supply chains, and when you tariff everybody, prices go kaboom and the economy goes crash. Like that's how it works when you say we're going to use this economic weapon, which is essentially a tax on the supply chain, which is essentially a tax on importers. It's essentially a tax on the people who receive the imports, the businesses. This happened already in the first Trump administration, and he wants to do it even harder. So the positive thing here is that we are truly at this twilight period. It's not pretty. There's going to be a lot of bad things done by the United States. I think we can all, as the regime as is currently constituted, we can all agree on that. But what comes out of it is already more positive. What we are seeing people do, that's why we talk a lot about China here. But what we saw Russia do in the special military operation was a positive thing for the world, standing up to the empire, pushing it back, asserting sovereignty. All what we've been seeing BRICS doing, what we've been seeing in terms of development away from the U.S., all of that is very positive, and I think it's going to continue. But it continues along the path of always being under threat by whoever sits in the Oval Office. Trump, otherwise, it's always going to be under threat, so long as the U.S. is organized around the interests of BlackRock. You should go back to it. So long as BlackRock, Vanguard, these huge monopolies that really see the world as their sole purpose, the world as its sole purpose for their profit, like their very narrow profits. That's it. That's what you're going to get. You're going to get wars. You're going to get any alternative being under threat, because they see any positives for people abroad, any positives for people anywhere, any attempt to make their lives better as a cut into what they want, the money and everything that's needed to get it. So any final thoughts, Brian, as we close up here?
Well, I think you touched on it. As long as these unelected special interests are still obviously driving U.S. foreign policy, and as long as all of the policy papers, including those linked to the Trump administration, as long as they're all talking about American primacy around the globe, talking about countering China, containing Russia, even Russia is mentioned in all of these papers. If you really believe there's a fundamental change taking place within US foreign policy, show me the documents where all of this is being written down. If you cannot, then it's just empty rhetoric. It's very easy to just make up lies, spread narratives. You don't need to have a foundation of consensus, policy papers, conversations about that. You just make it up on the fly, as the US always does. You're manufacturing consent, and that is part of that process. If there's no paper trail, then that's exactly what it is. If there is a paper trail, that is the policy, all of the policy being written down and connected to previous administrations and this current administration. It is talking about continuity of agenda. There is no break. The US abandoning Europe when they're openly, they're still running NATO and they're demanding that NATO expand its funding. And they even said, we're doing a division of labor. When they talk about the splitting off from Europe, that is just empty rhetoric. That is to sell it to you. They can't just come out and say it to you. And you say, well, what about Pete Hegseth? He said it in Brussels. Obviously, nobody cares that he said that because they defer to the more attractive narratives that the Trump administration is putting out there. And I see pro-Trump people completely sidestepping a growing number of exhibits of evidence that this is continuity of agenda. They're doing more sidestepping and they're performing more mental gymnastics to get over these obstacles. And this is what they did all during the first administration. And then in hindsight, you see them, well, the first administration, he didn't know John Bolton was a neocon, or he didn't know Mike Pompeo was such a bad guy. They didn't know any of this. And this time it'll be different. And then when he starts getting all new neocons and warmongers lined up for his cabinet, then come the excuses again. So the evidence is there. We can look at the evidence, we can talk about the evidence, but you can't wake people up who are just pretending to sleep. They see the evidence and they are making the choice to ignore it. And they're choosing a more attractive narrative that is being presented specifically for perception management. They are putting their faith in that instead. That is not how you do analysis. You have to separate your emotions out of it. Your wishes, your dreams, your expectations have to be put aside. You have to look at the cold, hard facts. And if the cold, hard facts add up to something unpleasant, you need to face that. You cannot just sidestep it, perform mental gymnastics over it, and continue on your way. That will catch up with you eventually. And this is what I'm trying to. People are saying, Brian has Trump derangement syndrome. Brian has lost his mind. I'm doing the exact same thing that I did the last 4 years. All of these people were happy to follow my work when I was poking holes into everything the Trump administration was doing and lying about. I'm continuing to do that under the Trump administration. I'm not invested in any of these people. I'm invested only in the truth. And I continue doing what I have always done. I am critical of it. I am following the money. I am following the policy paper trail. And I'm telling you what I'm finding, and I'm actually showing it to you too. And your answer to me is this empty rhetoric that all politicians use to trick the public into going along with their agenda. They have always done this. And you expect me to believe and to ignore all of this evidence that there actually is, that exists, and believe that this is the first time in human history a corrupt politician with a proven track record of lying and deceiving. He's serious this time. He's really telling the truth this time. I'm sorry. I don't buy it. I'm going to continue to speak out about it. It is costly to me. It really is. I watch my audience shrink over the last couple of weeks, but that's not what this is about. This is about, I don't like doing this, but like I said, I'm in a country that is now being threatened by the US, veiled threats of terrorism. And I want to wake people up to this so that I don't have to watch bodies dangle from trees in the city streets that I live in. And it's as simple as that.
Yeah. And, I think I run my show as a way to ensure that the analysis is full and that we have a full picture of, of history and what has led us here, because we truly are going into something. And if we don't understand how we got here and what got us here, and that means we won't really know where we're going, and that leads us to be pulled into shiny kind of maneuvers, which are dangerous, because all, this isn't cynicism. This is actually realism. Like, I can acknowledge this shift, because but whether that shift is apparent, whether it is fundamental, that question has not been answered. But history says that the United States, if it is constituted like this, regardless of whether Trump puts on a red cape and says, "I'm Superman," regardless, that shift is not fundamental unless the United States and its way of life and how it is organized and how its regime conducts affairs, who controls it, who are the interests behind it, what are the interests behind it, unless that is fundamentally changed, then we cannot expect there to be massive fundamental changes, but we can expect there to be changes. I don't expect the Trump administration to suddenly, throw out everything it's doing with Russia right now. I don't expect that. That would be negating recent history. But if we look at the history of U.S.-Russia relations over the long term, well, then I think, we have to be aware. We can't just fall in love just because things are looking better right now in the apparent. We truly are seeing contradictions moving so fast, Brian, and I think it's just so important to spell them out. The Europe, the scapegoating, to me, I am not sympathetic to Europe. I'm not sympathetic to Zelensky. But come on, like, my thing is the root causes, man. The root causes, it's the United States. And if the United States isn't going to take accountability, red flag number one. Red flag number one, and really engaging in peace is saying, well, we did this and we messed up and we've got to stop it. Not, it was Biden and everyone, in the United States. Oh, but those pretty javelins that we gave to you were so much better. To me, real peace is, we're gonna stop this thing because we did it. What would that take? What would that take? We shouldn't even. It's only been a month. We shouldn't even be. We should just be talking about the peace that has just been achieved. That's my opinion. Like, we should. Why does it take so long?
Could have been done. Could have been done. And what people are doing is making excuses because it hasn't been done, and they still want to believe in it. So they're making more and more elaborate excuses.
I want to just take a minute for an announcement, and then we're going to head out of here, Brian. You can find Brian's channel in the video description of this stream. On Saturday, I'm going to be doing a nice China stream with Li Jingjing, KJ No, and Carl Jia. So we're going to be covering all things China. Brian, you did a superb job here, but that will be good. 8 p.m. Eastern time on March 8th. So look out for that. I want to thank all of the moderators who came out tonight for a late night stream. I see Connie. I think I saw some others too. I don't know if Desiree Mantis, but whoever is members, Patreon members, all of the all of the viewers here, thanks so much. All of those who gave supers, it was an extremely generous night for supers. Thanks so much, including those who are very angry at Brian's analysis and probably my own as well. But thanks so much to all of you. I pulled up your questions, but I'll just pull up some of you now. Let Brian know no one is absorbing Russia. Okay.
Well, I mean, I'm saying that's the plan. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen.
That's
what they desire to do.
Yeah. I mean, balkanization of Russia essentially means just
talk about it all the time.
Make it weaker. And so some press say, I'm not a Trump fan. Yeah, I understand. But it was a great conversation. So I'm just pulling up some people who didn't necessarily ask questions. Lewis, who's been a fan since number one. day one. Thank you so much. We have Pasmo, who said, "Go back on calibrated."
I will. I will ask
You
Scott
will.
because Scott can always use the extra support.
We had a lot from Sparky. We didn't ask this question, Sparky, because you asked so many questions, but thank you. The point is taken about BRICS. Pasmo had this thing about 66 senators. Please wake up. Oh my gosh. Like, because of NATO, to pull out of NATO, like you need to break the law. And it's like, all right. He's not even putting on a show though. He's not putting on a I'm going, I'm leaving NATO
because
show.
people thought he was going to say that to Congress, and then what he did, and I'm like, how many times do people have to go through this process before you wake up? You're being manipulated here.
So I'm just trying to see who I didn't. Time Traveler, thank you. Jim, thank you. America will not fight China or Russia. Well, they want to.
Already are. Already are.
Yeah, I know.
They already are by proxy. They already are.
You're right. You're right. By proxy. So if you're talking about directly, I mean, there's surely many forces inside of the U.S. regime that want to, but as you said, Brian, they are by proxy, and they are because they can't do it other way. It would be you read all the wargaming papers. I've read them. It would be a disaster, and they know it. Thank you, Sherry, for being a member. And that's everyone. That's everyone. All right, everybody. We're out of here. See you Saturday night, 8 p.m. All about China. Show the same enthusiasm for a China-focused stream, because I think you're gonna like what Carl, Ja, and KJ know, and Li Jingjing are gonna have to say about where we are there. So everyone, good night. See you again soon. Brian will be back on here.
Thank you.
All right. Take care. Good night.